Hello, Tom Simmons coming to you with a brief introductory video for our next lesson in personal financial literacy. Now for this lesson, I'm going to have you think back to TV shows over the last decade. And you may remember that from 2013 to 2020, one of the most popular ongoing television series was a show called The Vikings. You may have watched it, you may not have watched it, it doesn't matter. The reason I bring that up is because a lot of elements of Viking thought and Old Norse thought came through in that show. And one of the beliefs of the ancient Norse was that your life was determined at birth. There was a very strong sense that your fate was already in the works and you couldn't change it no matter how hard you tried. And there were many reasons the Norse believed this, but one of them is a Norse concept called the Orlaeg, which is a Norse word that means that which was laid down before. It was the notion that so much of your life had already been determined by the situation you were born into. So for instance, if you think about it, you had no choice as to whether you were born male or female, white, black, Hispanic, whether you were born in the United States, Canada, Russia, the Congo. You had no choice as to who your parents were. You had little choice, probably no choice, as to whether or not you were born into a family that had many siblings, and many siblings born after you or before you. You had no choice as to whether that family was constantly struggling with money, was poor, or was quite privileged and wealthy with trust funds and assets to keep them comfortable. You didn't have a choice as to where you went to school. And even if you did, you didn't have a choice as to who your teachers were, and who your classmates were, and who your neighbors were, and whether the kids who lived near you were great friends or whether they were bullies who didn't like you. So many of these aspects of who we are were handed to us without us really having much of a say in them. Now, while the idea that your fate has been determined because it was all thrown at you is not something that is a positive thought, and many of us, maybe all of us, would like to believe that we can carve out a future that is different, or make a way that is new for us. The reality is we do bring baggage with us, whether we like it or not, and we bring an entire lifetime of experiences with us. And even sociologists today, not looking at ancient Norse lore, but looking at sociology today, would say that many of the things that we do and many of the decisions we make are based very much in part on how we were raised and the situation we were born into. And this is why sociologists will often refer to something called generational poverty. Why is it that we notice that if someone is having financial struggles, very often their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents also dealt with these issues of having enough assets to survive or to even thrive. So, bringing it back to modern times, and I'll give you a very, it might seem like a silly example, but when I was growing up, my mom always did the wash, and she always used Tide detergent. And it was never anything that I even gave a slight thought to. But when I moved out on my own and had to buy laundry detergent, I didn't think about it, I didn't compare prices, I reached for the Tide on the shelf. Why? Well, that's what Mom used, it must be good, so it must be what I'll use too. And the whole idea there was that I didn't put a lot of thought into that decision. That's just what we did. Another example of that. I know there's been a lot of news reports lately of flooding in streets from heavy rainfall, and people really seem to be freaking out because there's 5 inches of rain in the streets and it's over the curb, and isn't this awful? Well, I grew up in an area where it was very low-lying and very marshy. And we used to have water back up into the streets at every full moon and every high tide. So 5 or 6 inches of water in the streets was actually fairly normal. It didn't stop us from doing anything. I still delivered my papers on my paper route, and life went on as normal. I was raised in a very different situation than someone else who was not raised in that kind of situation and now sees 5 or 6 inches of water in the street. So the point here is that we're all products of our environment. When it comes to money, it's no different. We all have memories of one type or another about our families working through money issues. Some of you may have had parents that fought over money, and it was a constant source of conflict in the house. Maybe you had a single parent who was working constantly and still struggling. Maybe you were born into a family where that was not an issue, and you actually enjoyed a lot of vacations and special things because your parents weren't struggling with money. How we approach money and how we deal with our finances is often very much a function of what we grew up with and what we learned as very young children. Sometimes we do exactly what our parents did. Mom always did this for birthdays, and Dad always did this for vacations. Maybe they spent lavishly, maybe they were very frugal, and you are doing the same simply because that's what they did. On the other hand, what you do might be a reaction against what you saw in your parents' house. You got tired of them fighting over spending, so you've gone the opposite direction and have become very frugal yourself. Maybe even to your detriment, or vice versa. Here's what we want to do. In this lesson, we're going to challenge the idea that your fate is determined. All right? You are going to carve out your path in this life. You are going to make sure that your finances are in order and they work for you and for your life goals. But in order to do that, we need to back up a little and look at the decisions we make without even thinking about them, because it's what we're used to doing. And the more we can examine the knee-jerk reactions we have and the things we do automatically because we're not putting a lot of thought into it, the more we can see where we need to spend a little more attention in making sure that we are carving out a specific path and a specific plan for ourselves and our lives, and not just doing what comes natural or reacting against what it was that we didn't like when we were growing up. So let's make the assumption that yes, we are all products of our environment. We are all born into a social class and a race and a place and a body that we had no control over. But once we recognize how those things affect us and how they've affected our thinking, if we need to change certain aspects of our thinking, then we can do so. But the first step is in recognizing those issues. So with that, I will leave it at there, and I'll have you jump into the lesson, and we'll be doing a little soul searching as to what makes up who we are. Thank you. Tom Simmons saying goodbye.